Yes, hello everyone. Nice to be here. My name is Mia Svedäng. I'm a senior policy advisor for freshwater at the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation. And today I'm going to talk about buffer zones. So I will start by sharing my presentation. Buffer zones is what I'm going to talk about. And this is what I'm trying to cover today. I will say a few words about the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation first, and then I will talk about the riparian areas and why we need buffer zones. I will talk a bit about the processes in the buffer zone and different types of buffer zones, and among others, those in agriculture and those in the forests. And also I will mention ecologically functional riparian zones. And I will talk a bit about which dimensions we need for the buffered zones. And I will end this talk by talking a bit about buffered zones in different countries. So this is what I'm trying to cover today. But first I will start with a few words about the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, which is my organization then. It is Sweden's largest environmental organization, and it's very old. It was founded more than 100 years ago in the beginning of the 19th century, or the 20th century, in 1909. And it's a non-profit environmental organization, and we have over 200,000 members. And we also have our own environmental label, Good Environmental Choice. So that is us. And now I will say a few words about the riparian area. What are riparian zones actually? Well, riparian zones are the interface between the aquatic and the terrestrial ecosystems that connect and helps regulate the ecological functions of both systems. And the riparian areas, or the floodplains, are lands that occur along watercourses and water bodies, so along all different kinds of brooks and streams and so on, and also along lakes, of course. And the riparian areas, they provide important habitat for many species. But also the vegetation in the riparian areas can remove excess nutrients and sediments from surface runoff. So they are very important for a healthy water quality. And riparian ecosystems generally occupy quite small areas, but they are much more diverse and have more plants and animals than the areas in the vicinity. So they are really important for both the water chemistry and the biodiversity. And I will talk much more about that now, of course. So why do we want buffered zones? Well, the idea evolved in the early 1970s from the intention of better protecting conservation areas by minimizing the negative impacts of human activities on nature. So we have been talking about buffered zones for quite a while now. And what is it actually, a buffered zone? Well, it's simply a strip of land with permanent vegetation, which can be of different kinds of type. It can be trees or grass or something else, but it's permanent vegetation and it's next to a stream or a river or a lake. And stream side buffers are really important because they are multifunctional. They decrease pollution, they control erosion, and they provide wildlife habitat. So they do a lot of things at the same time. Well, we have heard from Maria about diffuse runoff from agriculture, and it's a very important source of nutrients to lakes and streams. So the proportions of inputs of total nitrogen and phosphorus by sources into surface waters within the catchment areas of the Baltic Sea are mainly diffuse sources. As you can see in these pictures, most of the load from nitrogen and phosphorus comes from diffuse sources, and those are of course much more difficult to attack than to stop inputs from point sources. So that's why we need buffered zones, for instance. So buffered zones, they act as natural filters. They can target both phosphorus and nitrogen. And an optimum situation for phosphorus, for instance, is not necessarily the same as for nitrogen. So they have a bit different requirements. But as you can see from this table, this is examples from different places in Sweden, Norway, and Finland, and it is about retention of phosphorus. As you can see in this column here, you can see that the retention varies quite a lot, but sometimes it can be really big. This is percent of phosphorus, and sometimes it's not so big, but it can really be a very important source of retention of phosphorus and also of nitrogen. So which are the processes then in the buffer zone that helps to take away nutrients and to provide all those other ecosystem services? Well, the processes in the buffer zones that reduce the load from sediments and organic matters and nutrients are deposition, and vegetation, for instance, grass, slows surface runoff, and it allows infiltration and sedimentation and deposition. But also absorption and plant uptake is important, and of course the nitrification, when different forms of nitrogen are converted to nitrogen gas that can just go way up into the air. So there are differences between phosphorus and nitrogen, and Maria also talked about this, because phosphorus is often transported as in particulate form, while nitrogen is often in solution. So phosphorus, if you want to reduce phosphorus, it's good to, while it is passing through the buffer, it's good if it goes very slowly, because then you can use sediment trapping. So the effectiveness of phosphorus removal is increased in buffers that enhance deposition, infiltration, and decreasing of flow velocity. And also soil characteristics do affect phosphorus behavior. Then if you look at dissolved phosphorus, it's quite different, but this is not the dominant form of phosphorus in agriculture runoff. And if you look at nitrogen, on the other hand, nitrogen is often transported in solute form. So nitrogen removal, the effectiveness varies widely, and it is removed through plant uptake, through microbial immobilization, through soil storage, and denitrification. And often, the larger the width of the buffer, the higher the efficiency of the removal of nitrogen. So a big or broad buffer strip is better than a narrow one. And Clement and co-operators found that they found no difference between different types of vegetation, though. They looked at forest and understory vegetation and grass, and they found that the nitrification was more or less the same. Buffer zones, they also reduce erosion. So trees close to the stream grow deep roots and increase riverbank stability. And that's really good because then you will not have lots of particles in the water. And it's also very good for the wildlife and biodiversity in the stream or lake or so. So buffers containing trees and bushes often exhibit greater species richness than buffers covering mainly by grass. So to have more varied vegetation and to have trees is really good, especially for wildlife. And it depends on that you get shading, which is very important for water temperature. And you also get organic material, for instance, leaves that fall into the water and serves as food for organisms in the water and for bacteria and so on. And dead wood also provides habitat and protection for fish and other aquatic organisms. So in a stream where you have more dead wood, you will also find more fish species and more fish. So this is a quotation from a book. I think it's really nice because it says, accepting the look of natural shorelines with many trees and shrubs will be the first step towards restoring habitats for animals using these areas on shore, as well as fish using the trees when they fall into the water. And it's from this booklet, A Second Life for Trees in Lakes. I added the link to that one, so you can look at it later on. So, I mean, we need to accept more trees and bushes along our rivers and streams and lakes. That would do so much good. So I will talk a bit about different types of buffer zones. There are many different names, and I don't know really if you can sort of say which name is the correct one, but I will talk about filter strips and forest buffer strips. So you can have buffer zones both in riparian forest areas and in farmlands. So you can have it in the forest and you can have it in the agriculture sector, and it does lots of good in both places. So filter strips, it's simply narrow strips of grass which you usually have alongside a farmland to reduce leakage from the soil to by nutrients and so on to a stream or a lake. But you can also have forest buffer strips, that is strips containing trees and grass, and you leave them. They are left for protection when carrying out harvesting in the wood, logging and so on. And then you can also have ecologically functional riparian zones. Those are even more multifunctional, and I will talk a bit more about those later on. So the effectiveness of buffered zones depends on different things. For instance, topography and which type of vegetation you have alongside the water, which soil type there is, the climate, and the extent of the nutrient load, of course. But the probably most important thing is the width of the buffer zone, how broad it is. So a few words about buffer zones in agriculture then. Well, as we've heard from Maria recently, agriculture is the largest source of human-related nutrients to the Baltic Sea. So it's a very important source for nutrients and eutrophication. And in the Baltic, it's 40% of the total nitrogen and 30% of the total phosphorus that comes from agriculture. And it comes from many different practices in agriculture, but the main nutrient leakage source from agriculture is over-fertilization practices. And that is both from mineral fertilizers and from manure. And also the loss of nutrient is, of course, correlated with variations in discharge. So, I mean, if it's raining a lot, much more will leak and so on. But the main problem is that we put on too much fertilizers. And then you can use grass buffered strips along fields to reduce the leakage. It's a practical way of managing agricultural fields, and buffered strips can effectively mitigate the movement of sediment, of nutrients and also pesticides in farm fields. And they do not require much space or specialized maintenance. So it's a really simple and a very powerful measure. So buffer zones can reduce leakage, and they, as I said before, they function as natural filters. As I also said, the removing of nutrients can vary quite a lot, but they can remove more than 75% of the sediments and more than 50% of nutrients and of pesticides. But there are sometimes difficulties in calculating the effect of the measures, especially when you're talking about phosphorus. And phosphorus can also be sort of, if you have an old buffered zone, it can be sort of saturated with phosphorus and start leaching also. So that's another problem. And as I said, you can also remove pesticides with the aid of buffered zones. So grass buffered zones are effective in reducing pesticide transfer from agricultural fields to water bodies. And there are a wide range of physical and biochemical processes that are involved in these processes. And the relative importance of different processes can vary. But the result is that you actually can remove quite a lot of pesticides or avoid them reaching the water. In the forest, it's a bit different. In the forest, it might not be eutrophication, which is the biggest issue you want to address. In the forest, you leave protective zones with trees and brush, and the forest buffer is a zone of forest left for protection, adjacent to a water body. And forest buffers, they can reduce inputs of nutrients and of suspended solids, and also mercury, which is a problem in forest areas, especially when logging, you have a big leakage of mercury. But also valuable terrestrial habitats supporting important biota is also maybe the most important thing with forest buffers. So some recommendations for buffer strips in the forest: establish forest buffers along all types of water in the forest, along springs or small streams and rivers and lakes. You need trees and vegetation close to all types of water to avoid leakage and to protect wildlife. The buffer should consist of multi-layered and uneven aged trees, so natural vegetation, and you have to adjust the buffered width to the local conditions, such as soil type, topography, vegetation, and also discharge. But it's very good to promote broad-leaved trees near forest streams so that you don't have coniferous trees, because they have a tendency to acidify the water. And also it's good to prevent soil disturbance within the buffer to minimize off-road traffic and so on. To leave the buffer strip untouched, because that's the main thing with the buffer strip. It's supposed to be a strip of natural nature that can protect the water alongside the buffer strip. You can also do, if you want to have even more good things from a buffer strip, you can establish ecologically functional riparian zones. So what is an ecological functional riparian zone then? Well, you can read about it in Lind and co-operators from 2019. It's a zone that's providing as many primary ecosystem functions as possible. So both a natural filter, reducing nutrients, also providing habitat and providing organic material as a source of energy for organisms in the water, and also stabilizing the banks of the waterway and providing in-stream wood, which serves as habitat for organisms and increasing flow heterogeneity, and also shading. So if you make an ecological functional riparian zone, then you try to have all these functions in one area. So I've already talked a bit about the dimensions, and I said it's really important how broad or narrow you make this buffered strip. So which dimensions do we need? It depends on what is the goal with the buffered zone. If you want to reduce sediments and nutrients input, you only require a quite narrow riparian zone, 3 to 10 meters, for instance. But if you want to protect many organisms and promote wildlife, then you require a wider riparian zone. It has to be more than 30 meters. So it depends on the goal with the buffered zone. Broader is most of the time better. If you have areas with steep slope, then you require wider buffers than flat areas. And to generate stable water temperature shading, a forested riparian buffer need to be wide enough, more than 20 meters at least. Often, but not always, broader buffer strips give more retention of nutrients and also of pesticides. And in Mayer and cooperators from 2007, they suggest that they estimated that to get 50, 75, and 90% of nitrogen removal, the buffer needs to be 27, 81, and 131 meters, respectively. So broader is often better. And here is a picture showing this connections, a low but significant relationship between the removal efficiency and the buffered width for sediments, for phosphorus and for nitrogen. As you can see, it's not a very great or a big relationship between buffered width and removal, but there is a certain relationship anyhow. And if you have a bigger buffer, you will have a better removal, a high removal of both sediments, phosphorus and nitrogen. And to ensure an ecological functional riparian zone, this is a quote from Lind, Hasselquist and Lorden from 1919. They say, there is no optimal width for ensuring all ecosystem functions and high biodiversity, but a 30-meter wide riparian zone ensures an ecological functional riparian zone, which with stable water temperature, a high floral diversity, and delivers sufficient organic material, in-stream wood, and bank stability. So 30 meters is good between the thumb and the finger to get a good ecological functional riparian zone. And here's another picture showing differences in how big buffered strip you need. The width of the riparian zone needed to fulfill different ecosystem services. For reduction of nitrogen is here, and for reduction of phosphorus, then you can have quite narrow strips, and also to take away sediments. Shading needs a bit more, and if you want to benefit amphibians and small mammals, it has to be even bigger, and birds needs even bigger zone, and fish quite a big one. So different widths of the buffer zone will be needed depending on what you are going to protect or what you want to achieve with the zone. Well, I will finish by talking a little bit about buffer zones in different countries, and I cannot say so very much, but I can say a few words at least. If you look at buffer zones in agriculture, there are few countries that have national regulations of buffer widths in agriculture. There are some countries, however, Germany and Switzerland, they have requirements for 5-meter wide buffer zones. In Sweden, there are no requirements. There are recommendations, but no requirements about buffer strips in agriculture. And if you look at forest buffer zones, they are used quite commonly for protection all around the Baltic. And it's different national legislation or forest certification and guidelines, different things determine how the forest buffers are implemented. Narrow buffers among about 5 to 25 meters wide are typically left along small watercourses, and sometimes more actually. And most countries around the Baltic specify fixed widths in meters, but not in Sweden and not in Finland. In Sweden, farmers can apply for funding for buffer strips. And in forestry, there are recommendations, but no legislation. So I don't know how the situation is in your countries. Do you have buffer strips and do you have any fixed dimensions? That's something that I would like to know. And I will also try to send out this question to all of you so that we can gather information from the whole CCB area. Because I think that buffered zones, both in agriculture and in forest, are really important to protect the water from to protect it from nutrient pollution and pesticides and so on, but also to protect the wildlife and enhance the biodiversity. So my takeaway messages are that buffered zones, they are multifunctional, so they can serve you with lots of different ecosystem services. They can reduce sediments and nutrients, and this only requires a quite narrow riparian zone, not 3 to 10 meters or something like that. And only grass is okay for this. But if you want to protect biodiversity in larger zones are required if you want to protect the wildlife and biodiversity. And then you need trees and bushes and to provide shade and food and habitat and so on. And buffered zones along all streams and water bodies in agriculture and in forestry would improve the environmental significantly. So that was all for me. Thank you very much.